They say evil hides best in the places we trust most. In 1988, the night was full of laughter, music, and the promise of tomorrow. But when the lights went out at Willow Creek Hall, one life ended, and a 41-year silence began. A girl who never made it home. A town haunted by whispers. And a killer who stood in plain sight wearing a badge of safety. This is the story of Lucy Wilson, the night innocence vanished, and the truth took 4 decades to crawl back into the light. It was May 21st, 1988, the night every high school senior in Hidden County, Alabama had been waiting for. The night of the prom. 18-year-old Lucy Wilson had been talking about it for months. She wasn't the most popular girl in school, but she had a kindness that made everyone around her feel safe. Her smile could calm a storm, and her teachers always said she had a rare mix of confidence and grace. That evening, her mother helped her zip up her pale blue dress, the same dress she had saved up for by working part-time at the local diner. Her father took pictures on an old Polaroid camera, the kind that printed memories right in your hand. They didn't know those pictures would be the last ones ever taken of her alive. Lucy left home around 7 p.m., promising she'd be back right after the dance. She wasn't the kind of girl who stayed out late or broke rules. She was responsible, careful, and always told her parents where she was going. The prom was held at Willow Creek Hall, a small event center on the edge of town, surrounded by trees and quiet roads. By all accounts, it was a beautiful night, filled with laughter, music, and the glow of string lights that reflected off the hall's glass doors. Lucy danced with her friends, took pictures in the parking lot, and even chatted with her ex-boyfriend Jake Harmon, who said she seemed happy and calm. Nothing seemed unusual. But somewhere between midnight and 1 in the morning, everything changed. When the music stopped and the lights came up, people started leaving in groups. Some drove off together, others waited for rides. But Lucy never made it home. When her parents woke up the next morning and saw her empty bed, panic set in immediately. They called her friends. No one had seen her. They called the police. And by sunrise, officers were already searching the roads leading to Willow Creek Hall. Lucy's car was still parked right outside the venue. The driver's door was unlocked, the keys missing. Inside, her shoes were neatly placed under the seat, as if she had changed into something more comfortable before leaving. Her purse was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no screams reported that night. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Detectives started questioning everyone who had been at the dance. That's when suspicion began to spread. 3 men quickly came under scrutiny: Jake Harmon, her ex-boyfriend, Robert Clay, a 27-year-old mechanic who had once worked at her school, and Mr. Harris, a history teacher who had volunteered to chaperone the prom. Rumors began to fill the town. Some believed Jake had gotten jealous after seeing Lucy dance with someone else. Others whispered that the teacher had been too friendly with her in class. The police questioned them all, but no arrests were made. There was no solid evidence, only questions, and a town drowning in fear. A few days later, a single piece of evidence surfaced: a strand of hair found near Lucy's car door. It was short, coarse, and not hers. But in 1988, DNA testing was still in its early stages. Scientists could tell it belonged to a man, but not who he was. That tiny strand could have held the answer to everything, but for decades it would sit sealed in a bag waiting for the world to catch up. As weeks turned into months, the posters began to fade from shop windows. The search parties grew smaller. Hope started to crumble. Lucy's parents continued to leave the porch light on every night, just in case she found her way home. Her mother used to sit by the window whispering prayers into the dark, while her father kept the Polaroid pictures lined up neatly on the kitchen table. Hidden County changed after that. People stopped letting their daughters walk alone. Every strange car was treated with suspicion. The prom, once a night of joy, became a memory no one wanted to relive. By the end of that summer, the sheriff stood before the Wilson family and said the words no parent should ever hear: "We've done everything we can." The case went cold. The unanswered questions became part of the town's silence. Who took Lucy that night? Why was her car left untouched? And who did that single strand of hair belong to? No one knew then that the truth was closer than anyone imagined. The man who took her had walked among them, unnoticed, trusted, and hidden behind a uniform meant to protect. And for the next 41 years, that secret would stay buried in the shadows of Hidden County. The disappearance of Lucy Wilson didn't just break her family, it broke an entire town. Hidden County had always been the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and waved at strangers passing by. But after that night in 1988, everything changed. The once busy main street turned quiet. Parents no longer let their daughters walk home alone. The whispers started small, at church gatherings, at the grocery store, at the diner where Lucy used to work weekends. Everyone had a theory, but no one had proof. And the longer the case dragged on, the more the lines between truth and rumor began to blur. Lucy's parents, Martha and James Wilson, never gave up. Every morning, Martha would check the mail, hoping for a letter, a phone call, anything. James kept Lucy's room exactly the same. Her books, her perfume, her prom photo still taped to the mirror. The scent of her favorite lavender lotion never really left the air. Weeks became months, months became years. The posters faded from the telephone poles. The search parties stopped coming. And one by one, the suspects went back to living their lives. Jake Harmon, her ex-boyfriend, moved to another state to escape the looks and whispers. The mechanic Robert Clay shut down his shop after people stopped bringing him business. And the teacher, Mr. Harris, quietly transferred to a different school. No one was ever charged, but none of them ever escaped the cloud of suspicion. Detective Harold Brooks, the lead investigator at the time, had kept every piece of evidence sealed and stored, including that single strand of hair. But back then, the science just wasn't ready. The FBI's National DNA Database, CODIS, was still new and limited. Without a match, the hair was just another dead end. By 1990, the case officially went cold. The file was boxed up, labeled Missing Person, Lucy Wilson, and pushed to the back of the evidence room, another unsolved mystery gathering dust. But for the Wilson family, time didn't move forward. Every birthday, every holiday, every year that passed was a reminder of what they had lost. Martha started lighting a candle by the window every night, believing that if Lucy was still alive, maybe she could see it, a small flicker of home in the darkness. James visited the police station once a month, asking if there were any updates. He brought cookies for the officers, hoping kindness would make them keep looking. But after years of the same answer, "We're still working on it," even he began to lose hope. The 1990s came and went. DNA testing evolved, but small-town departments didn't have the money or technology for advanced analysis. Detective Brooks retired in 1999, leaving behind a note in the case file that read, "If science ever catches up, this case will speak again." When the new millennium arrived, the world had moved on. But in Hidden County, the Wilson home stayed frozen in 1988. Lucy's prom photo sat framed in the living room. Her dress, carefully folded, was stored in a box under her mother's bed. Her mother still talked to her, every night before bed, whispering, "We sir, still waiting, sweetheart." By 2005, James Wilson passed away from heart failure. His last words to Martha were, "Dawn set, stop looking." She didn't. Even as age and grief slowed her down, she continued writing letters to state officials, news stations, and private investigators, begging someone, anyone, to reopen Lucy's case. Most never replied, but the ones who did always said the same thing. "Without new evidence, there's nothing we can do." And so the silence continued. Years turned into decades, and the story of Lucy Wilson became a memory told by older generations to warn the younger ones. The mystery of the girl who vanished after prom became Hidden County's darkest ghost story. But the truth was still there, locked inside that old evidence box, waiting for new eyes, new technology, and someone brave enough to dig through 40 years of dust and denial. Because somewhere out there, the man who took Lucy Wilson was still living his life, working, smiling, passing by the same streets where her name was once whispered in fear. And while the world forgot her, fate hadn't set. The story was instead over. It was only sleeping. By 2015, nearly 3 decades had passed since Lucy Wilson vanished after her prom. The old case file sat deep inside a dusty cabinet at the Hidden County Sheriff's Office, its edges yellowed, its label fading. Most officers who once worked on it had long retired, and for many, Lucy's name had become nothing more than a sad story from the past. But not everyone was ready to let her disappear forever. That year, the Sheriff's Department received a small grant, money meant to help review cold cases using modern DNA technology. The files were assigned to Detective Carlos Ramirez, a 34-year-old investigator who had recently transferred from Birmingham. He was known for being patient, thorough, and obsessed with details others overlooked. When he opened Lucy's file, the first thing that struck him was the photograph clipped to the front, a smiling 18-year-old girl in a blue prom dress. Her eyes seemed full of hope. Ramirez stared at that picture for a long time. Something inside him clicked. He whispered to himself, "You deserve better than a box and a label." The file contained hundreds of pages, interviews, statements, and faded Polaroid photos from 1988. The last entry, dated July 1989, was short. No further leads, evidence retained. But among the reports, he found something that caught his attention. A handwritten note by the original investigator, Detective Harold Brooks. It read, "If science ever catches up, this case will speak again." Ramirez smiled faintly. "Well," he said, "science finally did." He requested that all preserved evidence be rechecked. There wasn't much left. A few fabric samples, a bracelet, and that single strand of hair found near Lucy's car. The hair had been tested twice before, once in 1989 and again in 2001, but DNA technology back then was limited. Still, Ramirez decided to send it again, this time to a modern lab specializing in forensic genealogy, a field that could identify relatives of unknown suspects by comparing DNA to public ancestry databases. It was a long shot. The sample was fragile, over 30 years old, and degraded, but he knew even the faintest trace of DNA could tell a story, and Lucy's story deserved an ending. While the lab worked on the evidence, Ramirez spent weeks reviewing old interviews. He noticed something strange, a name that appeared in several reports but was never seriously investigated: Henry Hank Monroe, the security guard on duty the night of the prom. In the original statements, Monroe had reported a brief power outage in the parking lot around midnight, claiming a circuit breaker had tripped. He said he went outside, fixed the issue, and returned to his post. But no one ever confirmed that story. Ramirez dug deeper. Monroe's personnel file revealed a history of short-term jobs moving from one small town to another. He had no criminal record, but he had been fired twice for inappropriate behavior and unprofessional conduct. Both times, those complaints involved young women. The more Ramirez read, the more unsettled he became. Monroe's statement had been too clean, too practiced. He had described things that weren't even visible from his position inside the hall, as if he had been outside longer than he claimed. Then, while comparing the old building logs, Ramirez found a small but chilling detail. The power outage Monroe reported lasted exactly 17 minutes. 17 minutes. Plenty of time for something terrible to happen in a dark parking lot. Ramirez ordered background checks, spoke with surviving staff, and even tracked down Monroe's former neighbors. That's when he learned something crucial. Monroe had died in 2016, just a year after retiring, but he left behind a son who still lived in Alabama. Meanwhile, the DNA lab called with an update. The hair sample contained partial genetic material, not enough for a direct profile, but enough to attempt a familial DNA match. Ramirez felt something stir in his chest. After decades of silence, Lucy's case was whispering again. He reached out to the FBI's Cold Case Division for assistance. Together they decided to run the new DNA through national databases and compare it to public genetic genealogy platforms. Weeks passed. Every night, Ramirez reread Lucy's file, trying to understand how such evil could hide in plain sight for so long. Then, one afternoon, his phone rang. It was the lab director. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Detective, we might have found something. A partial DNA match to a living male relative, possibly a son." Ramirez's heart pounded. He asked, "Whose son?" The reply came softly. "Henry Hank Monroe." For the first time in 37 years, the silence surrounding Lucy Wilson's case began to crack. A new detective had found the thread, and this time the truth wasn't going to slip away. When the call came from the FBI lab, Detective Ramirez felt his heartbeat echo in his ears. For years, Lucy Wilson's case had been nothing but dust and silence, and now one strand of hair was speaking louder than ever. The lab confirmed that the DNA found at the crime scene shared a strong familial match with a man living in northern Alabama. That man was the son of Henry Hank Monroe, the same security guard who had been on duty the night Lucy vanished. Ramirez could barely believe it. A chill ran through him. For decades, Monroe had lived quietly in Hidden County, attending the same grocery stores, walking the same streets, even showing up at community memorials for Lucy, all while carrying the secret of her death. But before the detectives could announce anything, they needed irrefutable proof. The problem was, Monroe had died in 2016. There was no direct DNA sample of his in any criminal database, and his body had been buried for nearly a decade. Exhuming his remains was an option, but it was risky. Alabama's hot, humid climate could have completely broken down the DNA. Instead, Ramirez decided to take another route. He reached out to Monroe's only known living relative, his son David Monroe. David had grown up mostly estranged from his father. He remembered him as a strict, quiet man who rarely smiled. When Ramirez contacted him, David Sipp's voice was cautious. "My father? Why? What's Sipp's this about?" Ramirez took a deep breath. "David, I believe your father may be connected to a missing person sister's case from 1988. We're not accusing you of anything, but your DNA could help us confirm the truth, one way or another." There was a long pause. Then David quietly said, "If it helps bring peace to someone Sipp's family, I'll do it." Within days, a cheek swab sample was sent to the FBI Quantico lab. The process wasn't simple. Comparing partial DNA from a decades-old hair sample with modern DNA from a living relative required advanced technology and careful analysis. Scientists used a process called whole genome amplification, which allowed them to make millions of copies of the tiny fragments of DNA from the hair. Then, using targeted sequencing, they compared the remaining markers to David's DNA, searching for inherited similarities that only a parent and child would share. Weeks passed in tense silence. Every time Ramirez checked his email, his stomach twisted. He knew this could be the moment that either solved the mystery or sent it back into darkness forever. Finally, on February 12, 2023, the results arrived. The report was short, but the words hit like thunder. The DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene is consistent with a biological relationship to the son of Henry Hank Seth Monroe, with a probability of 99.97%. Ramirez read it 3 times. His hands trembled. 41 years after Lucy Wilson disappeared, they finally had their answer. Henry Monroe, the man who reported the power outage, who joined the search parties, who everyone thought was just doing his job, was the man who had taken Lucy's life. Ramirez leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. "We got him, Lucy," he whispered. "We finally got him." The news spread quickly through the department. Some of the older officers who remembered the original case cried. Others simply sat in stunned silence. After 4 decades of doubt, the truth had finally surfaced, and it came from one fragile hair that had survived time, decay, and indifference. When Ramirez called Lucy's mother, Margaret Wilson, the conversation was both heartbreaking and beautiful. He gently told her that DNA had confirmed who was responsible. There was a long silence on the other end. Then she said softly, "I prayed for this day, but now that it sits here, my heart doesn't know what to feel." Ramirez replied, "Masapam, your daughter Sep's story won't be forgotten. Sep's finally getting justice." For Margaret, it wasn't just the solving of a mystery. It was the end of years of whispers, the end of strangers' pity, and the beginning of truth. For Ramirez, it was a victory, but also a reminder of every case still waiting for a miracle like this. The DNA revelation didn't just solve Lucy Wilson Sep's murder. It proved something deeper. That time can bury secrets, but science and persistence can still dig them back up. And for the first time in 41 years, Hidden County could finally breathe. When the truth about Henry Monroe finally came to light, Hidden County fell silent. For years, people had driven past the old Willow Creek Hall without a second thought, but now that building, once filled with music and laughter, had become a haunting reminder of what had been stolen. Detective Ramirez stood outside Lucy Wilson's old high school on the morning of the official press conference. The school banners were faded, the classrooms changed, and most of Lucy's classmates had moved far away. But her name, Lucy Wilson, still echoed in the halls like a ghost that refused to fade. Inside the county courthouse, reporters, retired officers, and townsfolk gathered to hear what they had all waited decades to know. The sheriff took the podium, his voice heavy with both pride and sorrow. After 41 years, he began, "We can now confirm that Henry Monroe was responsible for the disappearance and death of 18-year-old Lucy Wilson in 1988. Thanks to the work of modern DNA testing and Detective Ramirez's persistence, this case has finally been solved." Gasps filled the room. Some people wept quietly. Others shook their heads, unable to believe that the man they once trusted, the man who guarded their community events, had been the killer all along. For Lucy's mother, Margaret Wilson, the moment was both devastating and healing. She sat in the front row, her hands gripping a photograph of her daughter in her prom dress, the same photo that had hung on her wall for 4 decades. As the sheriff spoke, tears streamed down her face. After the conference, she approached Detective Ramirez and said softly, "I always believed she'd be found. I just didn't know the truth would come so late." Ramirez nodded. "Sometimes justice takes the long road, my Stam, but it never stops walking." In the weeks that followed, the town tried to process what had happened. News outlets across the country covered the story. Cold case solved after 41 years. Security guard identified as killer. It became a symbol of how technology and determination could bring answers even when hope had almost disappeared. But for Margaret, it wasn't about headlines or closure, it was about Lucy. Every year since 1988, she had placed flowers by the lake behind Willow Creek Hall. This time, when she went there, she carried a single white rose, not for mourning but for peace. Standing by the water, she whispered, "You can rest now, sweetheart. They finally know." The wind carried her words softly across the surface, as if Lucy's spirit was finally free to move on. Detective Ramirez, too, felt changed. He had worked many cases in his career, but none had touched him like this one. He had spent nights poring over dusty files, chasing leads that went nowhere, and fighting the feeling that maybe some stories were just meant to stay unsolved. But Lucy's case proved him wrong. It reminded him that every file holds a heartbeat, every photo a soul waiting to be heard. After the case officially closed, Ramirez visited Lucy's old home, a small white house on the edge of town. Margaret invited him in. On the mantel were pictures of Lucy laughing, dancing, full of life. She would have been 63 this year, Margaret said softly. She wanted to be a nurse. She wanted to help people. Ramirez smiled sadly. In a way, she still is. Her story will help others never give up hope. Before leaving, Ramirez placed his badge on the table for a moment, not as an officer, but as a man paying respect. "This case reminded me why I started doing this," he said quietly. As he drove away, the sun dipped low over Hidden County. The long shadow that had hung over the town for 41 years was finally lifting. People who once whispered about the girl who disappeared now spoke her name with pride and tenderness. Lucy Wilson wasn't just a case number anymore. She was a symbol of perseverance, proof that justice may sleep, but it never dies. And though Henry Monroe would never face a courtroom, his secret could no longer hurt anyone. The truth had stripped away his disguise, and Lucy's light had finally broken through the darkness he left behind. In the end, Hidden County didn't just get justice. It got something greater, peace after 4 decades of silence. And as Detective Ramirez looked at the fading horizon, he whispered the words that had guided him through every dead end and sleepless night. "Time can erase the truth. It only waits for someone brave enough to find it." Some stories fade with time, but others refuse to die. They wait for the truth to catch up. Lucy Wilson's story is one of them. For 41 years, the silence was deafening, but in the end, truth spoke louder than lies. It reminds us that no matter how much time passes, justice will always find its voice, sometimes through people, sometimes through science, and sometimes through faith that refuses to break. If this story moved you, take a moment to think about the families still waiting for answers, the mothers who still light a candle, the detectives who never give up, and the voices that still whisper from forgotten files. Dan said, "Let their stories be forgotten." Subscribe for more real stories where truth finally defeats time. Because somewhere out there, another Lucy Wilson is still waiting to be found, and together we can make sure her voice is heard.